Okay, we're good to go. We're good to go, yeah. Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you maybe want to shut over the door at the back of the room there, can I welcome you on behalf of the Arab Organisation for Human Rights to the House of Commons for this seminar, which, according to the agenda I've been given, is when will the execution of innocent people in Egypt stop? Now, I'm something of a purist of this. I have been a member of Parliament since 2001. In 2004, I set up the all-party parliamentary group here for the worldwide abolition of the death penalty. And I take the view that, in fact, we shouldn't be executing anyone, be they innocent or guilty. But I think there is a legitimate concern which we should perhaps aim to explore this evening. And it is that while I dislike it, I think it is certainly fairly widespread that countries in different parts of the world do use the death penalty as part of their criminal justice system. As I say, I dislike it. I campaign to end it, but in a rules-based system which does rely on self-determination amongst nation states, sometimes I just have to accept that that is how some countries are prepared to act, and that is legitimate from their point of view. The use of a criminal justice system, and especially a capital criminal justice system, as a political tool by a country, however, I think takes that country outside any rules-based system of law, and I think that then makes the case for taking action against such a country onto a quite different level. You may wonder why I'm here. As I say, I have a long-standing interest in campaigning in relation to the death penalty. For the years I was a government minister, I was out of the all-party group, but in fact I'm now a member of it again, and I've just come back from an interesting visit to Japan, where we're at last seeing some progress there amongst lawyers and politicians towards the abolition there. I also have an interest in the Arab world and Middle East in particular, in the Gulf states. I'm chair of the all-party parliamentary group for Qatar, and I serve as a member of the advisory board of CABU, which is the Council for the Advancement of Arab-British Understanding, a body that may be known to some of you. So an interest in the region and a political first principles commitment to human rights very much takes my interest to the areas that you're going to consider today. You will see we have a number of speakers, and I will chair for the first couple of these, and then once Rhys, sitting to my right here, has delivered his presentation, I will, if you forgive me, take myself off, and Rhys will then assume the chair and chair for the remainder of the session. So that's all I really think you need to hear from me. And I would like then, without any further delay, to invite, first of all, Hannah Phillips, who is a researcher at the AOHR, focusing on the human rights challenges in the Middle East, and she's going to talk about the latest statistics of death penalty in Egypt. So, Hannah, the floor and the microphone are yours.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And again, thank you everyone for coming this evening to attend what's a much needed and timely discussion, which will focus on the growing use of the death penalty in Egypt in light of years of state violence and repression. So as we know, to kind of set the scene, back in January 2011, activists from the April 6th youth movement were demonstrating for democracy and against state violence, and they mobilized thousands of Egyptians in the demonstration in Cairo's Tahrir Square and across the country that took down the then President Mubarak. But the hopes that were raised by the revolution dissolved into sectarianism and chaos, and activists' aspirations began to be extinguished within a few years. El-Sisi, the defence minister and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, seized power in July 2013 and outlawed protests and cracked down on those who had started the revolution, as well as those who sought to reform or oppose his grip on power. Sisi's crackdown has unfolded amid one of the most expansive overhauls of the legal system in Egyptian history. After declaring a state of emergency and disbanding parliament in 2013, he issued a series of presidential decrees that granted him unprecedented power to silence his critics. Broad new counter-terrorism laws have been expanded, so the definition of terrorism now includes civil disobedience, which is limiting any ability to be able to hold the state to account for its actions. Therefore, since the revolution, freedom of speech has been severely restricted, and the ability of Egyptians to question or hold their regime to account have vastly dwindled. State violence against those who seek to remove Sisi from power have vastly increased, and now we're seeing a new generation of political prisoners as the result of this strict state repression and violence. Human rights abuses are now occurring at every point of the judicial process, which are vastly increasing and showing no signs of coming to an end. So since the replacement of the former President Morsi in 2013, Egyptian authorities have rounded up tens of thousands of individuals on politically motivated charges. What we're seeing now is an increase in the use in the death penalty against those detainees. Since 2013, an estimated 2,240 persons have been sentenced to death and referred to the Grand Mufti for approval. Among these, 1,157 have been approved by the Grand Mufti. So far, 96 have been sentenced to death after exhausting all legal means for an appeal. Among them, 45 have been executed. We can see from the image behind us that the type of people, these are young men, they're young, well-educated men who form part of a normal, healthy society. So where we are this year, so the month of February has seen several group executions of detainees who have been denied access to a fair trial and who have been subjected to torture and have had false statements extracted. So on the 3rd of February this year, the regime executed 3 detainees. The defendants were convicted of killing a police officer, but this ruling was issued with complete disregard for fair trial, as the court relied solely on the testimonies of security officers, which contradicted all other evidence and clearly showed that there was no legitimate evidence of any person specifically carrying out this crime. Essentially, the detainees were randomly accused of killing the Major General. The defendants were subject to grave violations at every point of the judicial process. They had been subjected to enforced disappearances, forced to confess to crimes under torture, without the opportunity to have these violations investigated at any stage of the inquiry or trial. Furthermore, later on in the month, on the 20th of February, a further 9 detainees were executed. This marked the 3rd set of executions in 1 month. The defendants were charged with the assassination of a former Attorney General in May 2016. Once again, the investigation was based solely on the findings of the National Security Service or officers. Documents of the case again lacked any physical evidence condemning the defendants and lacked any evidence that showed a connection between the defendants and the crime for which they were being prosecuted. It was evident from the video confessions before the start of the investigation that they had been extracted under threat. These confessions were used to convict them before they'd even been tried. Indeed, the court did not pay any attention to the crimes committed against the accused, nor did they refer these crimes in the trial. This disturbing magnitude of crimes perpetuated by the Egyptian regime has occurred under the watchful eye of the international community. Indeed, it has not only left the international community unstirred since the beginning of the events, but many countries who consider themselves defenders of human rights continue to have military, security, political relations with the regime. So the Arab Organization for Human Rights calls upon the international community to exercise its necessary and moral responsibility for the crimes perpetuated by the Egyptian regime. Turning a blind eye against these crimes makes all international human rights treaties and conventions worthless. The Arab Organization for Human Rights calls for the immediate end to the further use of the death penalty in Egypt, and an investigation into the pending cases where detainees have been issued death sentences to stop any further execution of innocent people. And we call for an open and transparent investigation into the crimes that have already been committed by the regime. The perpetrators of state violence must be held accountable, and international law must be upheld. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you.
Right. Are we going to open the floor for questions, or do you want to do that later on?
Perhaps we could take questions
Right.
at the end.
Okay. Well.
And then speakers will be dotted around.
Right. Okay. Right. Thank you very much, Hannah. Lovely piece of scene setting there. We'll move on now to hear from Rhys Davies, who's going to speak about the responsibility of the authorities behind the death sentences, which are based on false evidence and confessions extracted under torture. Rhys, as you can see, is a British barrister specialising in international criminal law and human rights law, a member of the list of counsel for the International Criminal Court and a special tribunal for Lebanon. It's the sort of lawyer I kind of thought I might have been one day, but never quite really had the talent or the application to get to. So, Rhys, the floor and again, the microphone is yours.
So thank you very much. May I just say, before you go, thank you very much for hosting us this evening, and thank you for those interesting words about what you were doing in Japan. Obviously, we have a particular particular country focus here this evening, but it's always heartening to know that there are people out there fighting for the abolitionist movement worldwide. It's not just the Middle East. Absolutely, absolutely. And everywhere from the US to Japan, because sometimes it can be seen, particularly sitting somewhere like here in Westminster, in London, in England, the world, etc., that we are in our ivory tower and we're preaching to other countries. But in fact, it's not just the most despotic regimes in the world. It's actually some of those that are, quote, the most advanced in the world that have the death penalty. I've been asked to speak this evening on the responsibility of the authorities behind death sentences, and as Hannah's already touched upon, the fact that a lot of convictions are based upon false evidence, and in particular confessions which have been extracted after torture. The situation in Egypt at the moment is one which I suspect we all know about, but the question of responsibility and accountability is a political question. It's not just a question of what prosecutors, policemen, judges are doing. It's about the climate that has developed, and in particular, in the case of Egypt, that's developed over the last 5 or so years. And what we've seen, and one of the things that Hannah has mentioned, is that there has been a significant uptick in not only the actual executions, but the numbers of people who've been convicted and held on death row. And alongside that uptick, we've seen a deterioration in the standards of the trials that have taken place. I'll come back to the question of the judiciary and the quality of the judiciary in due course, but I don't think anyone who's a watcher and an observer of this particular part of the world can say anything other than there has been an alarming trend, not only for the political interference in the judicial and the criminal justice process, but in particular, that political interference has led to what seems to be an increase in the use of torture to elicit confession. One of the other alarming trends, which anyone who's an observer will be aware of, is the use of military tribunals to prosecute, try, convict civilians. Now, I understand that there is an argument to say, well, actually, some of the offences that have been committed, some of the offences that are the subject of investigation are matters which are terrorist in nature and may have a pseudo military outlook to them, but that doesn't justify the whole-scale prosecution of individuals who are undoubtedly civilians in a military context. What we're seeing is actually the quality of justice in those tribunals is poorer, and we're also seeing huge numbers of convictions that result after mass trials. Literally hundreds of people are being tried at one time, and what that means is that defendants obviously don't get a chance to have their cases heard. They often don't have full access to lawyers, but it means that people are being dealt with as a herd, as a group, and of course that is not justice. It cannot be justice if you're rounded up and you're dealt with on a basis where your particular characteristics, your identity, and the allegations against you are not subject to the full scrutiny of the law. There was a case that I read about apparently in 2016. Human Rights Watch picked up on this. A 3-year-old child, was accidentally convicted as a result of one of these mass trials, and that really tells you everything you need to know. That is an obvious example, but goodness knows how many of these men actually had a fair trial. I don't know the individual cases that we can see up on the screen, but what we can guess really is that at least some of these individuals will not have had the scrutiny and the due process, to use the Americanism, the due process which is their right, is their basic human right. A quote which I read in the New York Times, which was an interesting one, if a chilling one, when describing the position in Egypt at the moment, was this. It said, "The arc of the Egyptian moral universe is not towards justice, but instead is toward the political whim of whoever has power." Sisi has power, and he's had power over the last few years, and he was re-elected, I think it was last year, with 97% of the votes. It's the sort of share of the vote that would make an old-fashioned Soviet dictator blush. He has a grip on power, and he's consolidated that grip. I don't profess to be an expert on Egypt, but anyone who's researched this area will know that there are significant constitutional changes taking place. On one hand, we have a very bold, brazen bid to amend the period in office that Sisi can sit within, and of course anyone who knows in international politics, that's the mark, isn't it, of the dictator, of the strong man who suddenly gets into power and says, actually, do you know what, I think I'm the best person for the job, why can't I do this for 20 years? But also, what we see is an amendment to the Constitution, which will allow the president to pick the heads of judicial bodies, to control budgets, to oversee a new council charged with looking after the affairs of judges. And what that's likely to mean is the removal of what's left of the separation of powers between the executive, the government, and the judiciary. And it will erode what is left of judicial independence. And again, that is the mark of dictatorial behaviour, and it's the mark of the strongman. And I said earlier on that I'd come back to this question of judicial responsibility and judicial accountability. I mean, it's not as straightforward as simply saying everyone who is tried is good and everyone who's in judicial office is bad. It is more nuanced than that. And actually, in the region, for many years, Egypt was viewed as having a very strong judiciary and a very strong moral outlook and moral perspective on matters of criminal justice. But that has been eroded over the last few years. And what we've seen are judges under pressure from both sides, all sides perhaps, and since the current president has been in power, we've seen this tendency towards political interference. And we've seen, amongst other things, a case which I wasn't aware of until I started research, something called the July 2013 statement case, which was a group of judges who signed up to a public declaration stating, amongst other things, that they wouldn't be involved in politics, that they supported righteousness, justice, legitimacy. They rejected amendments to the Constitution and called for the reinstatement of other parts of the Constitution, and they called for respect for the right for peaceful demonstration. Now, I suppose looking at things from a British lawyer's context, that is perhaps an eyebrow raiser that you see the judiciary getting involved in that kind of statement. But actually, many people will take the case that in the situation that's unfolding and has been unfolding for the last few years in Egypt, that sort of actually fairly bland statement is perfectly justified. What happened? Well, huge numbers of the judges who signed up to that declaration were removed from office. And so what we have now is a judicial system in Egypt which has been pressured, it has been eroded, and we see a political outlook in the criminal justice process that results in the lack of respect for basic human rights. And the United Nations has said on many occasions over the last few years that basic freedoms and basic criminal justice rights are absent, such that the basic requirements of a fair trial in many, many cases, setting aside the one-way street that is the death penalty, just from a starting point, these trials are trials which do not meet the basic requirements of international fairness. One of the things which I was asked to consider is the actual responsibility in the sense of what can be done to hold those who are involved in a corrupt system to account. Well, ultimately, my conclusion is a straightforward one. It's a political a mechanism that's available. The reality is that even if there is evidence of judicial foul play, even if there's evidence of prosecutors acting in a far less than impartial way, in a system like that which is being propagated currently in Egypt, and with all the pressures that take place, any change has to come from the top. And that's why it's important that people like Alistair and people like Mohammed at the Arab Organization for Human Rights keep campaigning on this area. I'm not going to tread on anyone's toes, I hope, because I know that Bill is going to be speaking in due course about the hypocrisy of the recent EU-Arab summit. But it seems to me that what we need as a group here and what we need as a society are for our politicians to stand up for what we say are our rights, and more than that, what are our universal rights. So if I can perhaps just leave you with that particular thought and leave matters there. And Alistair, as I say, I know that you need to get off. So once again, many thanks to you for hosting us this evening.
Thank you, Rhys. I'm going to take myself off now, and Rhys will chair the remainder of the meeting. Just on that final point, when CC came here in 2015, I was one of a handful of MPs who did actually try and create a bit of a fuss and a bit of a discourse within Parliament, and it's not always an easy topic to get public interest in or sympathy for, but believe me, if we are serious about human rights, then you can't just see it as being something that you have in your own country and you think then that's its job done. You know, for as long as there is any country in any part of the world that is not adhering to even the most basic norms in the way that we've heard described, then I think we all have to be concerned about it wherever we are in the world. So, Rhys, I leave the company in your very capable hands, and thank you all for your attendance. And look, I think, you know, certainly on the basis of the discourse that we've heard so far tonight, I hope that there will be further opportunities for the Arab Organisation for Human Rights to bring some of their concerns and some of their campaigns directly into Parliament, because this, as you say, Rhys, is where the political accountability for the likes of CC can be best pursued. So thank you for your attendance.
Maha, it's you. Yes. It might be easiest to be. I'll keep myself here, if that's all right. Do we have the right? Super. About 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Yes. Super. We're now joined by Dr. Maha Azzam, who's a speaker I suspect many of you know well. She's a good friend to the Arab Organization for Human Rights. Dr. Azzam is the head of the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. She is a member of Chatham House. You can see that she has in the pamphlet a very impressive CV and is really a leading expert and in a unique position to speak to us today about what's been taking place in Egypt at the moment, and in particular what the situation now is, how we've got to that stage, and who really is responsible for the deterioration in human rights in Egypt. And perhaps, if I may be so bold, you might have some suggestions as to where we should be going next. So if I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rhys. And a big thank you to the Arab Organization for Human Rights for hosting this, and for Alistair, who's on the CABO committee. And just to say that I'm also a board member of CABO, so I know they do a great deal of good work, and it was very good of him to host this meeting. So let me start. I mean, I think you touched on a number of things, and I'm glad you mentioned the political, because often with the issue of the violations in human rights, there is a tendency, and maybe rightly so, for legal experts and human rights experts to look at the issues, in their own context, and that is, something that one respects and is necessary. But as in all cases where there are human rights violations, there is a political context and there are political implications. And often those to blame for the increasing violations are those in power. And Egypt is no exception to this. I would like to just take you back in terms of 2011 and the Arab Spring and the promise of a better future for Egyptians. Egyptians had suffered and continue to suffer today under military dictatorship, a military dictatorship that lasted 60 years, as you know, and which from the prisons of Nasser to those of Sadat and Mubarak, all those who raised their voice would face the consequences of speaking out or being active. The prisons of Nasser were perhaps the worst years in terms of opposing that regime, a very dictatorial system. There may have been greater political space under Mubarak, but again, too, we were talking about a dictator of 30 years. The Arab Spring was an attempt by peoples across the region, and Egypt was no exception, to realize the freedoms and rights that Egyptians deserved and were denied for so long. It was a short-lived experience with post-2011, where there were free and fair elections, the first in Egypt's recent history. And those free and fair elections resulted in an elected president, an elected parliament, with all the consequences of that and the upheavals of that first year. But it was a very short-lived experiment. It was a nascent democracy and an experiment that was not allowed to continue because of the intervention of the military once again through a military coup in 2013. And essentially what Egyptians are going through today is that brutal interruption to their nascent democracy, a violent interruption. Egyptians were not allowed to see through that democratic experiment. And the ability of Egyptians to come out onto the streets in 2011 and speak out was one of the most frightening signals to the military and to the deep state and to all the interests in Egypt, the corrupt interests that had managed to hold on to power through corruption, through political power. And they wanted to make sure, once that military regime came into power in 2013, that it would never happen again. And those are the words of Sisi that we hear in many of his speeches. He keeps saying, I will not let what happened in January happen again. It is described in order, through the media and through politicians and those supportive of the regime, as if it was a period of chaos. Of course, it was a transitional period. It was a difficult period for Egyptians. But the idea that things had to, after 2013, be controlled and contained with such a degree of violence and control of all the institutions of the state in a way that was unprecedented even compared to the Mubarak era. So what we're seeing today in terms of a climate of fear that has continued since 2013 is an attempt by the military regime in Egypt to ensure that Egyptians live in a republic of fear and they do not speak out, whatever the political inclinations. The attack came against the Muslim Brotherhood, but then against all those who dared speak out. It was a strategy of the military regime to ensure after they took power, after Sisi took power, that the judiciary essentially became an arm of the military. The judiciary in Egypt does have a long history of independence, and I'm not saying that all judges are by any means complicit, but what we've seen is that there are judges that we know, and we know their names, and they are those that preside over the courts that put out these verdicts. There are 8 main names, supported by around 26, a circle of 26. This is a strong circle that dominates the judiciary, and where perhaps other judges are frightened to speak out or are not given the brief or the courts or the cases that are politically sensitive to deal with. What we have is a system in place now that has managed to put out the verdicts of executions and ensure that some of them are implemented, a large number of them. The fear is that there are more to come. And the fear is that, as we heard from Amnesty International, is that the confessions have come under duress, under confessions that have been extracted through torture, after disappearances. And the state of Egypt's prisons today, where there are 60,000 existing in inhumane conditions, and that are very likely to die a slow death because they are denied medication, and because the sanitation is bad, because the winters are cold and the summers too hot, there is overcrowding. We have in these prisons elected members of parliament, the elected head of state, Dr. Mohammed Morsi, and the youth of Egypt. We have the young and the old, professionals, anyone who may be picked up, in the same way that we see that those executed may have been randomly picked up and denied due process. That is the case with the thousands, possibly the thousands in prison. We don't know who's guilty and who isn't guilty. But what we're dealing with is guilt on the basis of charges of political dissent. So we have an absence of the rule of law. We have an absence of freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. Why we have this continued abuse and violations of human rights is because we have a dictatorial, and what one think tank in America, or I think it may have been Foreign Policy, just described recently as the move towards a totalitarian state. What Sisi is doing now is moving Egypt towards a totalitarian state. What we're seeing is also the absence of a free media. And what we've seen since the military coup is essentially the rounding up of journalists. Egypt, in terms of, according to Reporters Without Borders, is one of the worst countries for journalists. I think it's number 161 on an index, on a country index. Journalists are imprisoned, and starting from what hit the headlines many years ago with the Jazeera journalist till today. So in a climate where there isn't a free media, so that people know what is happening, so there is no a media that is subservient to the state, you have one of the main mechanisms through which these violations can continue and remain, for the regime at least, under some kind of control. But in reality, almost every family in Egypt knows of a family member or a neighbor's son or daughter or father or husband that has been wrongly accused or tortured. So Egypt knows. It knows through the satellite channels. It knows through the social media. And touching on the social media, of course, which is such an important channel for us today, in 2017 again, or maybe, yes, 2017, I believe it was recorded, or 2018, that over 400 websites were closed down. So the clampdown is continuous. There is scrutiny of Facebook, and it is an evil system under which Egyptians are living today. Economically, they are suffering, and therefore many can't even lift their heads to oppose what is happening. The popularity of Sisi was sold to the Egyptians and to the international community in 2013. I believe that according to a census called Basira in Egypt in 2017, and this was the latest census that I could find, his popularity had dropped to just over 20% or 25%. I believe it must be lower now. The economic situation is very bad. The violations have continued to escalate. And we have an attempt again by a military dictator to continue to remain in power, possibly till 2034. Through a constitutional amendments that will enshrine the military as the main political power and ensure even more control over the judiciary and the choices of those who oversee the justice system. And an amendment that will allow Sisi to run for 2 more terms of 6 years each. Now, this is brazen. It is unconstitutional, even by the terms of his own constitution, which of 2014. And it is a slap in the face of those in the West who may have believed that he was on the road back to democracy. I remember as campaigning as much as possible and lobbying after the coup, and being told that there was a roadmap to democracy, and that we should be patient, and that Egyptians need stability, and the international system needs stability. I believe that all the components of instability exist today in Egypt. We've had a war on terror continuing in Sinai, where there is no independent journalists reporting, where there are extrajudicial killings for which no one is held to account. We have the rounding up of youth and the executions that we've seen most recently. Executions that have happened by an emboldened dictator that returned from meeting with Angela Merkel and rounded up human rights activists, many of them women, went to a security conference in Munich, and which was followed by the execution of young men that again were denied a fair trial. There was the execution of 9 recently, followed by the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting, where European heads of state gathered. To all those European heads of states that say, oh, we whisper in his ear, we talk quietly about human rights because that can be more impactful, clearly it hasn't worked. the deals continue, and the argument that Sisi will be a friend of the West when it comes to controlling immigration and controlling any security threat is not an answer to the violations that are continuing, that are a contradiction of all the covenants and conventions of the United Nations. Egypt is a signatory to the Covenant Against Torture, and it violates this systematically. We know that the international community may be silent, but there has been a great deal of exposure of the violations that have happened. It is, I think, right to say that human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the OHCR, the rapporteurs working on Egypt have really exposed a great deal, as have journalists in major newspapers such as the Washington Post, the New York Times. They've done amazing work. So it isn't a secret that Egypt is one, under Sisi, violates the rights of its citizens, and it is a country that has no respect for the rule of law or human rights. But the question remains, why isn't that knowledge and those facts being translated into any real pressure from governments on General Sisi? I think we need, and this is maybe a practical line that we need to follow, is that the knowledge and the facts are increasing. He is increasingly exposed, much more than he was in 2013, 2014. It is accelerating. But we need MPs, and in a way, you know, I wish Alistair was still here, but we need more and more MPs to pressure. We need civil society to pressure. And we need more meetings like this, but perhaps more public meetings, gathering greater numbers, so that we have a degree of leverage from society, from civil society, and from members of parliament on their political parties and on the government in power. Because without that, governments will not listen. Even so, it will be difficult, but we need to increase the pressure, and that can only come from citizens who believe that values and interests can coalesce, and that ultimately the values that we uphold in democracies are exactly the same values that others deserve across the globe, and in this case in Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Bill, I think you're next up. Do you want to musical chairs, I'm afraid. Thanks, Hannah. Well, we now welcome Bill Law, who again is a good friend to the AOHR and will be well known to a number of you in the audience today. Bill, you're going to speak to us about what happened a week or two ago with the EU Arab Summit and the hypocrisy of that summit in failing to acknowledge the crimes that have been unfolding in Egypt. Bill is an expert in the Middle East. He's a Sony Award-winning journalist. He's a former BBC man who has been very well travelled in the Gulf and beyond, and is now, I suppose, a regional expert. So, Bill, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Rhys, and thank you to the AOHR for this opportunity to speak. And with your permission, Chair, I'm not going to speak about that conference of 2 weeks ago. What I wanted to do was talk about fact and fiction. Now, I think the previous speakers have all spoken eloquently of the facts of the situation in Egypt. And I want to look at the comfortable fictions that we are allowing ourselves to live with. So in pursuing that, I came across this document. It's an EU document from the General Secretariat of the Council to delegations, and it's called the EU-Egypt Partnership Priorities 2017 to 2020. And if I can quote from this briefly, this document, these partnership priorities aim to address common challenges facing the EU and Egypt, to promote joint interests and to guarantee long-term stability on both sides of the Mediterranean. The partnership priorities are guided by a shared commitment to the universal values of democracy, the rule of law, and the respect of human rights. And it goes on to talk about proposed priorities: inclusive growth underpinned by innovation, and effective and participatory governance governed by the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Talks about sustainable, modern economic development, trade and investment, talks about social justice and social development. The EU and Egypt will cooperate in the promotion of action on climate change, stabilizing the common neighborhood, cooperating in crisis management, enhancing stability, and on it goes. And on page 7, I see a modern democratic state, that the Egypt and EU are committed to ensuring accountability, the rule of law, the full respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and responding to demands of their citizens. The EU will support Egypt's efforts to enhance the capacity of state institutions for effective public sector reform, enhance the capacity of law enforcement institutions in implementing their duties, as well as to develop the new parliament's constitutional functions. And on it goes. My goodness, what a document, what a statement that comes from the EU. Stability. Well, I suppose you have to ask yourself, what is stability? Do you achieve stability through repression or the granting of human rights? It all depends what you mean by security and stability. Now, clearly, the Egyptians, the Gulf ruling families, they've decided that repression is the way to secure stability, and we have agreed to simply go along with that. Now, Maha has spoken eloquently and as Rhys of the situation regarding the judiciary, which is now utterly compromised. So for a document to speak about the reform of the judicial system and actually sit and watch that system being eroded and systematically destroyed and say nothing is quite extraordinary. And of course, we can look at some very slight and modest gains. Shaukan has been released, and we can celebrate that, I suppose, but there's extraordinary restrictions. He has to, if I can just find the document from here, it is, yeah. So Mahmoud Abu Zaid has faced what Amnesty calls ludicrous probation measures, which require him to spend 12 hours of each day at a police station from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for the next 5 years. This is a man who's a photojournalist who was simply doing his job of recording the atrocities of the Egyptian security forces. I think, too, if we look at going back to this document, the EU document, it speaks about trade and investment, and also speaks about the offshore gas fields. Now, here we come to, I think, the nub of why we allow ourselves, and the EU allow ourselves to sail along in the sea of hypocrisy, because actually the sale, the big sale is weapons. And guess who has tripled in the last 4 years their purchase of weapons from Europe, from Britain? It is Egypt. And what are these weapons used for? Well, they're used in the battle against terrorism, but we also know they're used against their own people. And as regards the offshore gas, that's a hugely valuable resource. So we come back, as we always do, I think. We circle back to, oh yes, weapons trade and energy. Weapons trade and oil and gas. Now I thought, well, let's look at this. This document came out on the 16th of June, 2017. So I thought, well, let me look at what else happened on that day. And I'll go back to Amnesty again. 16th of June, 2017. The Egyptian authorities, this is Amnesty calling for this, the Egyptian authorities must immediately stop the imminent executions of 7 men sentenced to death in 2 grossly unfair trials. So here we are, 2 years down the road, and what do we see? More executions. Nothing has been done. Well, okay, that's the EU, that's Europe. Well, let me turn to the United Kingdom. And again, I've gone back to 2017, and this is a document that's drawn from a press release. And at that point, Alistair Burt, the minister responsible for the Middle East, had just been newly appointed or reappointed to his position, and he was about to make his first visit in that ministerial capacity to Egypt. And this document speaks of an opportunity to reinforce the UK's position as Egypt's top economic partner. The UK is the #1 investor in Egypt. Investments in the first half of 2016-17 alone amounted to $2.9 billion. It says here. This is, I'm sorry, I don't have the pound equivalent off the top of my head, probably 2.3 billion pounds. The minister will discuss new investments and new support, UK support for Egypt's economic reforms, including through providing additional technical assistance to reform policy in the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Investment, Ministry of Trade, and Ministry blah, de blah, de blah. And Minister Burt says, I look forward to my first visit to Egypt following my reappointment, and the UK is a long-standing friend, and this visit to Cairo is an ideal opportunity for me to discuss further UK-Egyptian collaboration in many areas, including education and economic reform. The UK is Egypt's #1 economic partner, the largest foreign investor in Egypt, and a strong supporter of the government's economic reform programs. This is one of the myths, I think, that Sisi and the army has been able to propagate, is that we are coming down hard. We are coming down hard on terror. We're coming down hard in order to ensure that there's stability so that the economy will benefit all. And in fact, the economy is lurching along and benefiting not very many people at all. Now, again, I'll go back to what happened on that same day. That is the 23rd of August of 2017. And guess who was in Cairo that day? Well, it was Jared Kushner. And Jared Kushner was there to promote his deal of the century, the ultimate deal, whatever you want to call it, the deal that he's trying to drive down the throats of the Palestinians. And the Egyptians were annoyed at that point. Sisi was annoyed. Why? Because the Americans were withholding about $200 million worth of aid. Quote, we wanted to send the message we're not happy at the lack of progress in human rights and the NGO law, a State Department official said. We want to see improvements. It's hard to believe that there was still a State Department that seemed to care about human rights. And now that was when Rex Tillerson was in charge. And to me, that seems like a very long time ago. And I don't hold out a great deal of respect for what Rex Tillerson did, but at least he did put the flag out for human rights. Mike Pompeo, human rights, it's not a comfortable fit. He only talks about it when he's launching another tirade against Iran. That's the only time. Well, Iran has an appalling human rights record. You know, that's absolutely the case. But then so does Egypt. We know that. We understand that. Now, in Pompeo's infamous I am an evangelical Christian Cairo speech on the 10th of January, go through the speech. Will you find any mention of human rights? Of course you won't. Just as in Alistair Burt's delightful expository expression of delight in heading to Egypt and working on big trade deals. No expression of concern for human rights. Now, the title I was assigned for this, my brief conversation, is The Hypocrisy of Britain and the EU in Their Approach to Crimes Committed by the Sisi Regime. Well, I hope I've showed you, just by going through these two documents, the level of the hypocrisy. But then I thought it's always worthwhile to go back and sort of go to the dictionary and see what hypocrisy means. So I've done that. Hypocrisy is the contrivance of a false appearance of virtue or goodness while concealing real character or inclinations. In a general sense, hypocrisy may involve dissimulation, pretense, or a sham. The American political journalist Michael Gerson says that political hypocrisy is the, quote, the conscious use of a mask to fool the public and to gain political benefit. Now, in regards to the EU and the UK, I would say that definition ticks all the boxes for hypocrisy. A false appearance of virtue or goodness, tick. An attempt to conceal real character or inclinations, tick. Dissimulation, pretense, a sham, tick. The use of a mask to fool the public and gain political benefit, tick. So the question is, will we all be fooled again? And if we're not to be, how do we treat with this malignancy, this terrible hypocrisy that leaves ordinary Egyptians at the whim and mercy of this brutal regime? Well, I think the way we do it is, as already been suggested, is by putting political pressure on, but I think we need to call it out over and over again. It's that finding hope where there seems to be no hope message. I have a good friend. He's the UAE human rights activist, Ahmed Mansour. Now, Ahmed is serving a 10-year sentence. His last appeal was just thrown out at the end of December. He's in Al Wathba prison in Abu Dhabi, which is a terrible, terrible prison. And why? Because he called for reform. And as has happened in Egypt, so is happening right across the Gulf, is any attempt to ask for any mild measures of reform is being led with a maximum amount of repression, using anti-terrorism laws to justify this. So I asked him, he was out of jail at that point, why he kept fighting for human rights when it was certain to put him back in jail. And he told me the only way to counter repression is by revealing it. And I think that what I would conclude with by saying is the only way to fight this awful, terrible hypocrisy is to reveal it and to challenge it and to call it out over and over again. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. So, thanks. Next up, we have my good colleague Aidan Ellis. The trip hazard, Aidan. Yeah. Where there's blame, there's a claim. Aidan, as many of you will know, is a well-respected international human rights and international criminal law barrister. He's currently counsel on the Gaddafi case at the International Criminal Court and an expert generally on international criminal law. Aidan, you're going to speak to us about the question of whether or not there is really a difference between these political executions carried out by a pseudo-judicial process and the random or, I suppose, authoritarian killings by personnel on the streets. So if I can hand over to you. We've got about 10 minutes as well.
Thank you, Rhys. After hearing those very eloquent accounts of the political situation, it falls for me to give you a slightly drier presentation, I'm afraid, about the legal issues surrounding the death penalty. And my starting point for that is probably with the right to life itself, as it's defined in Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's an interesting place to start, because Article 6 begins in this way. Every human being has the inherent right to life. There it is. Now a piece of customary international law, very clear, unambiguous, strong. But it then continues with the flip side of the coin, the negative definition of the right, and that is, no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life. It's arbitrary deprivation of life that is prohibited by the Covenant. And that, I think, reveals the reality that although, of course, there are many campaigners for a moratorium or for abolition of the death penalty, as a matter of international law, the death penalty remains lawful. There have been UN General Assembly resolutions, non-binding over a period of years, calling for abolition. Steps have been taken at a regional level by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and also, of course, here in Europe with the Council of Europe and Protocol 13 to the European Convention. But set against that movement for abolition, there are still more than 50 states retaining the death penalty, and those include some of the most populous and powerful states in the world. It's too early, I'm afraid, to say that there's any real sign that public opinion in those countries favours the abolition of the death penalty. And so I'm afraid we're not going to see it being abolished on a global scale anytime soon. And that has the consequence that you cannot treat execution following a legal process or an apparently legal process in the same way as you would treat the killing of a demonstrator at a political rally, for example. Of course, what you would expect to follow from the deliberate killing of a demonstrator is a criminal investigation in the national sphere. You would expect to see the individual perpetrator and those around them, those who assist, those who order, being investigated and prosecuted. And if that doesn't happen on the national scale, and if it's part of a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population, it may reach the level of a crime against humanity, which could be investigated and prosecuted internationally. And that's one of the things, of course, the International Criminal Court investigated in Libya. But in the case of an execution following a court procedure, it seems to me human rights law does far better to look at the process that led us to that point. Because whilst human rights law has not been able to abolish the death penalty yet, it has sought to impose strict limits on the circumstances in which it can be imposed. The first of those is that it should only be imposed for the most serious crimes. That coming from Article 6.2 of the International Covenant, or even from Article 10 of the Arab Charter on Human Rights. And it's generally acknowledged that what that means is the most serious offences are offences involving intentional killing. They're certainly not drugs offences or economic crimes. And that's often a specific concern in relation to Egypt, just because of the broad range of crimes capable of attracting the death penalty in Egypt. But it's also clear that the death penalty should not be imposed unless there has been a fair trial. And it's said that that means meeting all the fair trial requirements that we've heard about today, all the due process norms, the presumption of innocence, adequate time and facilities to prepare a defence, an independent and impartial tribunal among them. The African Commission, in its third general comment, made the point that mass trials resulting in the death penalty without due consideration to fair trial standards are illegal and should not take place. And that, of course, must be right, because anybody who has conducted a criminal trial attempting to balance the rights of more than one defendant on trial at the same time knows that's an incredibly difficult exercise. They each have different points that they want to raise. Someone might want to raise that they had an alibi. Somebody might want to accept they did it, but say that what they did was justified. Someone might want to say that a particular witness is biased against them, but not necessarily the other defendants. You cannot respect those fair trial rights in cases involving hundreds of defendants without devoting far more time to those cases than is being done. And specifically in relation to the issue of fair trial rights, the concern about torture in Egyptian cases is raised time and time again. Egypt is a party to the Convention Against Torture. It therefore has the obligation to carry out a prompt and impartial investigation wherever there is reasonable ground to believe that an act of torture has been committed, and to ensure that any statement made as a result of torture is not admitted in any criminal proceedings, unless, of course, it's in criminal proceedings against the person who carried out the torture. There has already been a UN Committee Against Torture investigation into Egypt, hampered by a lack of cooperation by the authorities there. But it concluded that there was evidence of systemic torture in Egyptian cases. And that's particularly a concern, of course, when those cases result in the imposition of the death penalty. Finally, of course, the death penalty should only be imposed after individuals have exhausted their appeals and requests for clemency. and it was a particular concern identified by UN special rapporteurs in relation to the February executions, that at least some of them appeared to take place whilst petitions to the Supreme Constitutional Court were still pending. Focusing on the process when we're talking about death penalty cases and on whether those minimum requirements of a fair trial have been met isn't a sign of weakness, because it's there that a remedy may lie. One possibility seems to me to be submitting communications to the African Commission on Human Rights itself, Egypt not being a party to the protocol that would allow individuals to go to the African court directly. But you can still submit communications to the Commission. There are a couple of quirks of that procedure to be aware of. The first is that you don't have to be the victim yourself to submit a communication. A friend, a family member, even an NGO can submit a communication to the Commission about an individual's predicament. Secondly, the Commission does have the ability to impose provisional measures. It can, if there is the threat of irreparable harm, which there clearly is in a death penalty case, the African Commission can order a state not to carry out certain steps until the case is concluded. I'm not saying, of course, that the African Commission has the power to enforce those provisional measures. States like Egypt can and sometimes do act in defiance of those provisional measures. But here is where the legal overlaps with the political that we've just heard about, because it seems to me that it's harder to keep swimming in the sea of hypocrisy once there are more judgments out there from international human rights bodies and more evidence that states are not following them. So it seems to me that the legal and the political need to work together on cases like this. Thank you.
To our last speaker now, Ben Keith, who is also a international criminal law barrister. Ben also specialises in human rights generally, as well as extradition. He's at 5 St Andrews Hill Chambers, and I see, Ben, that you're described by the Legal 500 as being really clear and straight to the point. So with that, you're going to tell us about some of the legal options to challenge the crimes that have been committed. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rhys, and thank you to everybody else who's gone before in the discussion of these very important issues. And thank you for Aidan for covering a large amount of the international law options. I've got a few more which I wanted to talk about. But one of the things I was asked to examine was the fact that we seem to be in total political paralysis in terms of being able to get any movement of the Egyptian political process to improve human rights. And I'm not an expert on Egypt, so when I started my research on this project, I looked for the hallmarks of what I consider to be a totalitarian state, and it seems to me that many of those hallmarks, in fact all of those hallmarks, are existent in Egypt. And sadly, I think, Dr. you were saying earlier that we might be moving towards the totalitarian state in Egypt. I would hazard a guess that, in fact, we're almost there. And the hallmarks of totalitarian states start with freedom of the press. When freedom of the press goes, there is no challenge to authority. And freedom of the press can be the manipulation of the press, but we have gone much further than that. We've gone to the repression and persecution and torture of journalists. The next step is the persecution of political opponents and the threatening of judges. Previously, we were discussing earlier the fact that the judges are often afraid of what's going on, and that is a common theme of totalitarian regimes. We know from a large body of research in Russia that many of the Russian judges are not in fact necessarily corrupt or necessarily follow the state policy of their own volition, but they know that if they step out of line, then sanctions will be severe. And it's exactly like that in Egypt. You don't have to necessarily believe in the regime, but the judges have to know that if they don't do as they are told or do what the state expects them to do, then they will find themselves in jail as well. It's not that far from where Erdogan's purges in Turkey have landed, Turkish civil society. I think earlier on we mentioned the fact that Rhys mentioned the fact that the elections had were won with a fantastic 97%, and the talk of changing the constitution to keep the president in power for a much longer period of time. The next people to go, usually the lawyers, and we can see from the use of the death penalty, from the mass trials, which are an anathema to a Western lawyer, a trial where you just ship in a load, hundreds of people and convict them all as a mob, rather than giving them their own individual opportunity to speak or to put their case forward, means that fair trial is essentially non-existent in Egypt. And they've also come for the NGOs. I know Bill mentioned it. So the non-governmental organisation law in Egypt is the most repressive that I have seen. Again, there's been a lot of writing, a little bit of writing about this in Egypt, a lot about it in Russia, and the parallels are quite similar. In Russia, there's a law showing that any foreign funding has to be declared, and it's exactly the same law. The Egyptians have copied it from Vladimir Putin. They've put it into action, and that law says that if you are an NGO who receive foreign funding, as many NGOs do, or many journalists and human rights workers do, then you have to declare that. But in Egypt, it's not just about declaring it, it's in fact a crime for which you can be sent to prison for a substantial amount of time, which is a much worse, much worse than any other use of that particularly repressive law that I've ever seen. And Bill mentioned the hypocrisy of the United Kingdom in what we can do about this situation. And you've got to compare the speeches and the campaigning that happened recently in relation to Saudi Arabia. And many people in this room will be familiar with the Jamal Khashoggi case and how many of us campaigned to find out the truth of that situation. And the British government reacted surprisingly well at the time. There were very strong statements made trying to force the Saudi Arabia to comply with their international obligations. That has, since that case is now no longer on the front page of the newspaper. I think it was earlier this week that the Foreign Secretary is becoming ever more desperate for the arms deal with Saudi Arabia to go through again. So everything that we campaigned for and the people keep campaigning for in Jamal Khashoggi and the repression, the Saudi regime is brushed under the carpet because it's no longer a news item at the front of everybody's minds. And that's where we're left with Egypt. The terrifying prospects of us being a trading partner with Egypt of such economic magnitude means that, and the European Union document is laughable that the bill put forward, shows us just how little we care about human rights when money is involved. And so we have this real problem as campaigners and as lawyers in keeping these human rights issues at the forefront of the news, in order that there is no let-up in displaying this repression and the torture and the horrific things that go on in Egypt. Legally, there are not many things that we can do. The law really is a tool in these circumstances rather than the answer to any of the questions that we've posed tonight. Of course, Egypt is a member of the ICC, but as Aidan's explained, most of these death penalty cases and trials take place within the auspices of a trial process in Egypt prescribed by law. And in those circumstances, the fact that the law is horrendous and in breach of human rights means that it's almost impossible for the International Criminal Court to do anything about it other than to tut and write the odd article. There are, to my mind, the best opportunity for any legal remedy is the use of sanctions against individual people in Egypt. And there is quite a strong Egyptian sanction regime currently in place, which has weakened gradually over the years. The question is who do you sanction? Do you sanction the president? Do you sanction government ministers? Do you sanction individual judges? How much impact will that have? And then we go back to Bill's statistics about the billions of pounds that the United Kingdom trade with Egypt. How willing are British businesses and British politicians going to be to say, well, actually, we're not going to trade with these individuals or these companies or these entities because of the horrific breaches of the human rights, when that involves cutting off our livelihood and cutting off our business. And so where we are now is at the start, I think, of a campaign to try and bring the misuses of international law, the misuses of domestic law in Egypt, and the repression to the attention of the international community, using as many tools as we have at our disposal. The United Nations have criticised significantly Egypt. Aidan referred briefly to the Convention Against Torture, but there was a series of special rapporteurs, the rapporteur on extrajudicial killing on arbitrary detention, and produced a significant report on Egypt. It's saying that torture was systemic, and torture wasn't just systemic, but the Egyptians denied that there was any problem whatsoever. And that is a classic example, again, of plausible deniability in the Egyptians' mind, so they can say to the international community, well, we don't torture people, it doesn't happen, this is fake news. But it's not fake news, and what we're trying to do here is create the news to show Egypt in its true light, which is a country hell-bent on repressing civil society.
Thanks, Ben. We have, yeah, of course, yes. We've got a few minutes for some questions. So, do we have any questions from the floor?